afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. It is 4 o'clock. I think that's the correct time to start. There may be a few people drifting in while they finish their coffee, but we'll get started to make full use of the time that we have. I'm Professor William Webster. I'm from the University of Stirling in Scotland. I'm going to chair and moderate this session, so I'll do a few introductions about the panel, about how we've organised it. And then we will move on to our usual format, which is 3 short presentations followed by Q&A. So the Q&A session, of course, please bring yourself up to the mic to ask questions and I'll moderate those for the panel. Okay, so let me introduce this particular panel that we have here this afternoon. The panel is titled Dignity, Technology and Human Values in Smart Technological Environments from Design to the Lived Experience. So what we're trying to do here on this particular panel is slightly move away from a very legalistic session. I'm the director of a research centre called CRISP, the Centre for Research into Information Surveillance and Privacy. We have a very broad remit which looks at very broad issues around the impacts and consequences of surveillance technologies in society. We're a research centre that's spread across a number of different institutions in the UK, so the University of Stirling, University of Edinburgh, University of St Andrews, University of Essex and Coventry University. And we're quite unique in that we do focus on the impacts and consequences of modern surveillance technology. So we're not exclusively law experts or data protection experts. We have quite a broad remit on surveillance. That's reflected in the way that we've constructed the panel. So we've constructed the panel from a number of different perspectives to try and draw out different views about the lived experience and human values around the development of new technology. So if you want to just pull up our speakers again. I'll just quickly introduce them. Okay, so we have a panel then. I'm just going to read out a couple of lines from the panel description so that you get a sense of the flavour of the direction we're travelling in. Okay, I'm just going to read out the first line and the last line. So the first line talks about established thinking about the importance of designing in human values into the development of new technology. So the values that we might be interested could include dignity, fairness, autonomy, transparency, and these go beyond fundamental, legally recognised human rights into other important human rights. So the dominant view is that these values will not naturally be accommodated in new technology, and we have to make a conscious effort to design them in to make sure that they exist in the way that technology is used and experienced. Now, alongside that, what we're going to try and explore here is how we design in those values and how we can contrast that design process with developments in the lived experiences of those using technology. So we're interested in that gap, the gap between the design and the lived experience. So the panel is going to try and highlight some of those ideas. So we're going to try and draw out the discrepancies between the two. In the idea of trying to identify some valuable lessons in terms of how we might move forward. So this is relevant to both design, it's relevant to theory, and it's relevant to practice. So we have a number of speakers who are going to speak. They're going to do short interventions in a moment. We have Hielke Hijmans from the Belgian Data Protection Authority, Anaj Puri from Tilburg University, Carolyn Wilson-Nash from the University of Stirling. I'm the moderator. Unfortunately, Philippa can't be with us because she has a new post and her new employer didn't want to let her come to Brussels. But I have a surprise speaker who's going to take her place, but I'm not going to announce that until the other speakers have spoken. So don't get too excited. It's not me. Okay, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to our first speaker, Hielke, who is going to do his intervention first. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there's my pen, my slides. Some of you will recognize the layout. Some of you don't. Most of you don't. I'm very happy to speak here. I'm at the same time at the Belgian Authority, and also I teach at VUB on the European International Data Protection Law. So I'm the one whose core business CPDP is. I'm a data protection lawyer. I'm a lawyer. And so I will speak as a lawyer and also as a regulator. I see if this works. Yeah. I would take you a bit with what does technological changes mean for the law, and what could be a viewpoint of a lawyer. That's what I try to do in this 10-15 minutes I'm given. As a data protection specialist, but not only that, I think the best starting point for looking at legal developments, technology from the perspective of the law is, and talking about human values, what we do here is to look at recital 4 of the GDPR. Recital 4 of the GDPR is mentioned everywhere, all the time, etc., but it's extremely important, and that's why I want to highlight it here again. It's about data processing. We could think about it on other issues. Recital 4 says simply, the processing of personal data should be designed to serve mankind. And I think that is important when we talk about AI, talk about ChatGPT and all the new developments. All these new developments are there basically to serve mankind and not the other way around. This is, I think, the starting point. This should be the starting point for data processing, and it's not so easy in the current world when we talk about automated decision making, for example. But it is the starting point, and the starting point we should always keep in mind once we, as lawyers or regulators, or try to think what is important to do. How can human values be designed into new technology? I think that was one of the questions of the panel. AI Act is a good example. Also, the GDPR itself talks as one of its general provisions about data protection by design and by default, but it's mainly by design, ensuring that when you develop new systems, when you develop new technologies, that you design it in a way which is data protection of more general human rights friendly. That, I think, is a good thing. What is the goal of it? I think the most important goal, as we develop now, as you develop, you talk about developments, is about control and controllability. Humans should have control of technology. That's, I think, what we should keep in mind all the time. In data protection terms, it's much simple: control over your personal data. So you need to be able to have access to your personal data and to use your data protection rights, to make it simple. But it's a bit wider. It's much wider. It's about human control. See if this works. Yeah. I think, looking again at the GDPR, the controller, so someone who processes personal data, should adopt internal policies, etc., to ensure data protection by design and by default. And you can do that, and you should do that, and I think that with all developments in mind of technology, by the fact that you minimize risk, I think. Minimize risk, minimized processing, pseudonymization as soon as possible, early in the process, transparency with regard to functions and processing of personal data. It's just what I read here is not more than is what's in recital 78 of the GDPR. But it's also when the recital also, and then you kick in the question, to what extent does the GDPR apply in that stage? But the question is that when you develop, design, and select using applications, etc., you should always be encouraged to take into account the right to data protection. So, right to data protection as a metaphor for human values in a much wider sense, but starting from the design process. And I think that's also, if you look at the AI Act, that's how the AI Act is put in place. Human values key. That's also part of the questionnaire of this panel. What are human values? I can make it simple, but of course it's much more difficult. But if we as societies in Europe or wider Europe have written our main values in the law. First in the European Convention of Human Rights of 1950, and much more recently and limited to the European Union itself in the Charter. These are expressions of the human values, which at least in our Western society, in European society, I don't talk about the rest of the world, is key and which should be taken, is put down in the law. These human values do not change as a result of technology, but of course there are serious challenges. It is the task of us, I think, and that's what I already tried to say, to ensure that these human values are respected in the digital world. That's, I think, when I have to do cases as a regulator, when we have complaints, when we have to decide on cases in technological areas, that's what we always keep in mind. And it's not only data protection, it's also democratic rights, free speech, in the context of ChatGPT, for instance. Non-discrimination. It's an important element of rights around profiling. Profiling as laid down, for instance, in Article 22 of the GDPR. Last but not least, upholding the rule of law. And that's really something which is key, I think, because how can you, with self-learning systems, etc., ensure that the rule of law is always upheld if you cannot explain as human beings exactly why certain decisions are made, for instance? I try to go to the next slide, but it doesn't work. When I do that, I also look at judgment of the Court of Justice. One was a bit overlooked. The judgment, the reference is here for you who follow the work of the court. Case brought in by the Ligue des droits de l'humain here in Belgium, but basically on PNR. And what the court said, well, basically, how can the self-learning systems, machine learning is, how can that be used in the law when the goal is that you predetermine the criteria for assessment, for instance. If you don't, the law says you must assess things for this and this and these reasons, and then but then the system is self-learning, and then you cannot basically assess whether or not your criteria are being met. So that's an important issue. As the court said, it might be impossible to understand the reason why a given program, in a given program, for instance, arrived at a positive match. That's, for instance, when you talk about PNR data, it's someone who is held by the, who is stopped at the border because he has a risk, he has a big risk of becoming, of being a criminal, of being a terrorist, or doing wrong things. You must understand why this person is being stopped at the border. And if the system is self-learning, it's very difficult to assess this. And another thing, and that's also what the court said, everything should be, there should always be, because you're subject as a person to all kinds of decisions, can be on your credit, can be on crossing borders. There must always be a way to have an effective judicial remedy. Well, this effective judicial remedy becomes difficult if systems are taking decisions and no longer people, and people don't understand this. A current case which is pending is a case before the Court of Justice in a case called Shufa. It will, for those who are interested in the law, you will come across this case in some time when the court decides. It's about creditworthiness. The fact systems are checking whether or not, when you go to a bank, you have the right to have credit, you want a loan for your house, whether or not you're credit worthy. There, decisions are being made based on profiling and automated systems. So how can you ensure, and that's the big question, that it's still explainable what happens, and that someone can really decide on what's happened because based on knowledge? Those are the questions I think we are faced with. Short introduction, as said, this was just a first reflection as a lawyer. The question, of course, always comes up when we talk about new systems, whether or not we can should be positive about technology or not. Are we still able to uphold our human values? To what extent? I've listened also to what extent does AI help us? I'm sure that in certain areas AI helps us enormously. Medicine is always the example, or the care for elderly people. A lot can be done on basis of AI, but there's also the other side. How can we ensure that we stay in control? That's the starting point for me of this conversation.
That's great, thank you. Let's move straight on to our second intervention, which is going to be, Anaj is going to start slightly more from, not from a legal perspective, we're going to move into an ethical position, so all yours.
Thanks, William. Hello, everyone. When William asked me to be part of this panel, there was a story that was playing on my mind, and this was the story that Time magazine broke as regards workers in Kenya being hired for $2 an hour for labeling data as part of an outsourced contract for OpenAI, so as to make that AI system, ChatGPT, safer. And when the question came in terms of designing human values in AI system, I thought it would be a question worth inquiring into, that whether we can claim that we are incorporating human values in AI systems unless we take into account the interests of the workers who are actually working on the ground and are looking at some of the vilest stuff on the internet in order to make those systems safe for us. So that's the focus of this short intervention. What I wish to highlight is that our existing regulatory structure is focused on the front end of human values. It's focused on users' interest. It's not focused in terms of the development process. It's focused more on the deployment and application process. But the lack of this holistic approach leads to an insincere and incomplete outcome when it comes to incorporation of human values. To counter this, I'm going to suggest 3 ways. One is of looking at the intrinsic values of the interests of AI workers. Second is in terms of the constitutive value, in terms of how our values are interrelated. And third is in terms of the instrumental value, that unless the workers who are making AI systems are safe and not exploited, the resultant AI systems will not be safe and cannot be said to incorporate human values. So that's the outline. When I was thinking about this initially, in my mind this was a non-starter, that there cannot be any justification for suffering when it comes to learning. But philosophers have a funny way of surprising you when you start taking things for granted. And there is a peculiar thought which emerges, which in some ways justifies suffering in the course of learning. I do not necessarily agree with this trend, but for what it's worth, there's this idea that during periods of suffering, we also go through periods of moral growth. That when we reflect upon our suffering, we become better people. That through challenges we evolve and we become better people. I think there might be a kernel of truth to it, maybe not a lot. But that idea loses its moral appeal when the sufferer and the learner become 2 different entities. Once the suffering and learning outcomes become dissociated, there cannot be any moral justification for learning through suffering, and that's not a moral outcome, that's just systemic exploitation. These are some of the values that we hold dear. I will argue that there's significant moral momentum in the world that we can say with some degree of conviction that these are not just European values, these are human values worth aspiring for, but that's open to some debate, I suppose. Now, if the challenge is to incorporate these values in AI systems, then can we really just incorporate them by regulations which are aimed at users' interest, which are aimed at not spreading bias, which are aimed at not spreading misinformation? These are all laudable objectives. But if we do not take into account the interests of the people who are developing these systems, we will not be able to achieve these objectives. The first example that I have for your consideration is from a news report, I think it is from around 2019, when Washington Post wrote about the plight of online content moderators in Philippines who were tasked as a workforce with reviewing suicides and massacres to decide if such content should remain online and protect the firm's reputations. This scavenging, this cleaning, this act of ghost working is currently not acknowledged in the regulatory structure. The proposed AI Act talks about training data sets, validation, testing, and with the proposed amendments by IMCO and LIB, I believe the focus when it comes to foundation models is also in terms of ensuring that the copyright protection is there. It nowhere directly refers to these concerns. I have, as part of the introduction, already alluded to this concern. But before I come to why should we be concerned about this, I want to briefly talk about the harm suffered on account of these practices. Think of the plight of the worker who, for want of better opportunities, who on account of her socioeconomic circumstances is forced into this labor and is then subjected to the worst form of content that you and I can avoid on account of the indignity suffered by her. That's an affront to her dignity. It takes a toll on her mental health. And this worst form of economic exploitation does not even result in any kind of skill acquisition. It's not that she can leave this job and subsequently, on the basis of the skill acquired, find a better avenue. If we want to incorporate human values in AI system, if we are sincere about those efforts, I believe we should be concerned about this. Before getting on to the three approaches that I mentioned, I want to talk about the impact that this should have and perhaps does have on the user's trust. When we are dealing with AI systems, more often than not, our trust inquiry remains at the surface level. We are concerned with the ease of use, whether the data that I'm sharing for using maps, whether it is giving me the desired outcome. I'm not concerned with what's happening at the back end. But once you become aware of the exploitative practices behind the system, can you still trust the system? At the moment, this is not even part of the equation. The ghost workers who are under the radar, they are not part of the regulatory focus. But the reason why they should be part of the focus is as follows. Firstly, there's an intrinsic value to their rights and their dignity. There are three cases which are presently apt examples of this, but there is some problem with the way this litigation is being approached. The first case is presently pending before a district court in California. And what the two workers are trying to establish is that they have suffered psychological harm on account of watching hours of disturbing videos as part of their roles as online content moderators for TikTok. Previously, similar actions have been settled by Facebook and YouTube, and a similar claim is pending against Reddit. So it's an industry-wide problem. The reason why I said this is an inadequate remedy because these claims have not been brought in as part of an AI regulation. We still do not see AI workers as stakeholders when it comes to development of AI systems and when it comes to AI regulation. If this intrinsic approach doesn't work, perhaps I could persuade you with a constitutive approach. I chose not to include the screenshot, but in the aftermath of the January 6th Capitol Hill attack, Elon Musk tweeted about what he called as the dominoes effect, that how a social media platform which started as a website on campus to judge women on the basis of their looks led to a man standing wearing a Vikings hat at Capitol Hills. Our values do not exist in isolation. We cannot expect a platform founded on misogyny to not spread misinformation. Our value ecosystem is interlinked. This is a very strong reason why we should be concerned with the plight of AI workers. This is a constitutive approach. Lastly, an instrumental reason. This are some relevant excerpts from the report submitted by the Federal Trade Commission to Congress outlining online harms, the ways we can combat online harms through innovation. These excerpts highlight the limitations of deploying AI systems for online content moderation and for the need for the human in the loop. But it warns against, please focus on the last line, the humans in the loop deserve adequate training, resources, and protection to do these difficult jobs. Employers should also provide them with enough agency and time to perform the work and should not use them as scapegoats for the tool's poor decisions and outcomes. This is an instrumental view that if we do not look after the interests of the AI workers, we will not have safe AI systems. 3 reasons why we should. But how do we go about it? 2 suggested measures on the ethical front. Firstly, a declaration on lines to be included in development and deployment of all AI systems, that all precautions were taken to ensure the safety and welfare of data labelers and content moderators. This is a strong version. A weaker version of this could say all reasonable precautions or all necessary precautions. We could also consider something like on the lines of a fair trade mark, where each data set comes with a label attached whether due diligence and good practices were followed to look after the health and safety of the workers or not. In terms of the regulatory measures, as I mentioned, the focus of the proposed AI Act is in terms of the safety and in terms of the accuracy and veracity and the lack of bias of the data sets. The focus of the Digital Safety Act is in terms of content moderation. These are laudable objectives, but they do not take into account the back-end concerns that I have highlighted before you. The proposed solution, in my respectful opinion, is that we need a direct regulatory intervention, and the 2 regulations which are best suited for this, the proposed EU AI Act and the Convention on AI, they should include direct and explicit compliance provisions regarding health and welfare of data labelers and content moderators. At the moment, they touch upon these issues in a very tangential manner and only in garb of transparency obligations. To conclude, when we usually discuss the alignment problem, we are concerned with the technical aspects. We are concerned with black box problem. We are concerned with explainability. We are concerned with what happens if our technologies' objectives are not aligned with human values. But I think we should also be concerned with the practices that are put in place in development of that AI system. The principle of garbage in and garbage out is not just in terms of the technical outputs, but it's also equally applicable to the social values. Machine learning through human suffering will not lead to development of AI systems that respect human values. And the incorporation of these values requires us to adopt a holistic approach that focuses not just on the users, but also in the interest of the AI workers. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anaj. We're going to go straight on to our third intervention. Carolyn.
Just test this works.
I don't think you're on yet.
Am I not on? There we go. All right, hello everyone. I am Dr. Carolyn Wilson-Nash, and I'm going to be talking to you today from a slightly different perspective. So I'm going to be talking about consumer values. So obviously, with all this AI technology or digital technology, everyone here, we're all a consumer. We all have mobile phones. We all have laptops. So consumption and consumer values are really important when it comes to technology design. My special focus is on aging consumers and technology. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Obviously, there is this stereotype, and most of you have probably heard that older people cannot use technology. Nod of heads if you've heard that stereotype. Yeah, older people technology, not usually synonymous, but my research finds otherwise, that older people love using technology, enjoy using technology, they find it very useful, they find it very helpful. However, not all technology is designed with the older person in mind. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. All right, so just a couple of points on my research interests. I'm interested in digital technology consumption by aging consumers. So that's what my PhD started out as. And it was all about looking at older people using technology over a prolonged period of time. What are their lived experiences of using that digital technology? What are the barriers they come across? What are their enjoyments? What are their motivations for continuing to use that technology? My second research interest is on digital technology consumption by vulnerable consumers within health and social care services. So this is very much based on a project that I've done recently. So the Scottish government put iPads in place in care homes across Scotland during the pandemic so that older people could contact their relatives and could have calls with their relatives. Because obviously, I don't know if you're familiar with the UK restrictions during COVID, but care homes were shut down and no visitors were allowed. Care home residents were even told to remain in their rooms for long periods of time and couldn't even socialise with each other. So the idea of this was for iPads to be placed into the care homes so that at least the residents could call their relatives. So I'm going to talk to you about those two projects today. But the sort of theory that I'm going to be using and explaining today, is the technology paradox. So I don't know if any of you have heard about technology paradoxes before. We all experience them. Everyone here has probably experienced a technology paradox at some point in your life. And it's essentially when you experience different things, but simultaneously at the same time. So you experience some sort of contrast, but completely at the same time or when using the same technology. So there's a quote here. Mick and Fournier were the original academics who came up with this term, technology paradox. And they have said, although the paradox concept has been elaborated in different ways over the years, particularly outside the field of formal logic, it has always centered around the idea that polar opposite conditions can simultaneously exist, or at least be potentiated in the same thing. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today, is this idea of technology paradoxes and what paradoxes older people are experiencing when using technology. Okay, so the first one we've got, I'm going to go through 5, but the first one we've got is control chaos. So you probably will also resonate with this. But basically, the idea that someone feels in control when they're using that technology, or that they buy a technology in order to control a certain part of their life. But at the same time, this technology can cause utter chaos and carnage, and really put that person in a state of flux and distress and even anxiety. So the example here is from Christopher. One of the reasons for persuading myself I would like an iPhone was that if I, for instance, entered a date in my diary while I was out at, say, a committee meeting, I could, 1, be sure that the day was clear, 2, enter it, and 3, it would appear automatically on other devices. Great, it works, he says. However, what I hadn't bargained for was that almost everything else appears on almost everything, leaving my pocket version metaphorically bulging with spam, pictures of my loved ones at a football match, and unedited scatterbrain notes of my next project staring down at me. So in other words, Christopher uses his iPhone in order to control his diary, but he didn't realize that everything syncs together. So all his information syncs onto his phone. He has all this unwanted information on his phone, causing absolute chaos and carnage. So those two things are experienced simultaneously, this idea of control and then this idea of chaos. Okay, so the next one we have is efficiency, inefficiency. So a lovely quote here of, just got back from a great holiday where my Kindle was invaluable. I read loads of novels, but did not need to pack any in the suitcase. So there you've got efficiency of being able to read and being able to read quickly without having to get a lot of books and bring them on holiday. I bought a few via my Kindle while I was away. Also, I used it each day to keep up with my emails. I find it very useful to see what emails are coming in, but as it's not easy to reply via Kindle, I've responded to anything urgent via text on the mobile. So the lady here, she's using her device, and it's very efficient for her to read books. She can check her emails on it, but it's not very efficient. It's inefficient for her to reply to her emails, probably because of the difficulty of the keyboard and being able to type on her Kindle. So you can see here that a device is creating simultaneously both efficiency and inefficiency. The next one is assimilation, isolation, and I'm sure everyone here has experienced this. So give me a nod of heads if you've been out to dinner or you're having dinner with your family and everyone is staring at their phones. Yeah. So although we have our devices, we have our mobile phones in order to communicate with people, in order to chat to people on WhatsApp or go on Facebook or go on Instagram, the actual act of doing that can isolate you from people in the world and people physically around you. So you have this paradox of assimilation, being connected to people through your phone, but isolation, which is disconnecting you from other people within society. The quote here is actually slightly different in that Victoria and Elizabeth, they were part of a book group, and they both used Kindles, whereas everyone else in the book group used traditional paper novels. And they found that there was this disparity between the Kindle users and the non-Kindle users. So they, as Kindle users, would talk to each other about their Kindles, so that Kindle would bring them together and assimilate them together. However, the fact that they were distanced from other people in that book group meant that they were isolated from the non-Kindle users. And we see this a lot, like we have this, I'm a Mac, I'm a PC user. Everyone associates with some type of technology. So you together as a group using it are assimilated, but you're isolated from other people not using that device. Okay, the next one is competence, incompetence. And this one is really quite serious. We've talked a lot about sort of suffering and human values. But what we were finding a lot through the data is that a lot of the time, some people were using technology and getting sort of this really good confidence boost from being able to use it. So you can see here that Maria, who calls her iPad iJack, which I just love, she feels really proud of herself because she managed to download the iPlayer app onto her iJack. But then later on in the quote, you see that she's not able to get her list of apps back. She's struggling, she's trying to scroll, she's trying to find where her apps were. She finds out that all she needs to do is slide to the left and her apps appear. In that sort of moment, she's also being really self-deprecating now and calling herself Dumb Maria. So what really is probably something that's quite difficult for someone to understand and maybe a design fault has turned into someone feeling incompetent about being able to use technology, which isn't going to breed confidence in the user. So we were finding that people are have competence, but also at the same time or in a split second feel incompetence about technology use. Oh, don't know what happened there. Sorry. There we go. So the next one and final one I'm going to talk to you about is independence and dependence. So show of hands or a nod of heads, anyone who's been stuck whilst their mobile phone's drained of battery and they're stuck in the middle of nowhere, maybe haven't got their train tickets, don't have Google Maps, can't ring anyone. We feel quite sort of, I don't know, it's quite stressful. It causes anxiety. So although these devices that we're using give us incredible independence, we're able to look up information, we're able to get from A to B, we've got our plane tickets on it. At the same time, if that device loses its battery, what do? So we're too dependent on technology a lot of the time. We have this independence, but equally at the same time, we have this dependence. And this slide I'm going to talk to you about here is about the project that we did in the care homes in Scotland relating to the iPads. And we saw this independence-dependence paradox. So the iPads provided the residents with independence so that they could contact their relatives during the pandemic, also so they could watch videos, but also reminisce on things like sport or dance or whatever their hobbies might be. So there was incredible independence given to the residents, but equally at the same time, residents were dependent on the call schedule. So in the care homes, because there were so many different people wanting to use the iPads, everyone was on a call schedule. So everyone only got 10, 15 minutes to call their loved ones. So there was this dependence on the call schedule. And actually the quote I've put there is all about how someone needs to be booted off for the next person to come on and be able to use the iPad. There was also dependence a lot on the care home staff. So while a lot of the residents could use the devices themselves, many of them had sort of cognitive or dexterity issues, which meant that the staff had to use the iPads with them, or at least be present unless, in case there were any issues. So there was that dependence on the staff also being able to use the iPads with the residents. And then, as I gave you the example earlier, they're also dependent on battery life. If these iPads are being used by many different residents in a day, they might not be charged by the time that resident, it's their turn to have their call with their loved one. So again, there's this independence-dependence paradox. So what coping strategies do people come up with? And I think this is what was really quite amazing from looking at the data, was that there are negative coping strategies. So there's coping strategies like neglect, where people end up just putting the technology in a drawer or showing some sort of indifference to the technology. But generally speaking, the coping strategies were all really, really positive. So one example is partnering, and you saw that with Maria, where she called her tablet iJack. So establishing a technological possession, a close sort of committed, heartfelt relationship with it. That's an example of partnering, or calling a device a name. You then have mastering. So a lot of older people are very keen to master the technology. So read the handbooks, they read the advice, they ask friends and family for help. They really want to try and master that technology. Then there's adjusting, or you might have heard this as bricolage. So it's altering a technological possession in order to resemble familiar devices, software, and past experiences. So if someone was to get an iPad, one of the first things they would do would be to install apps that they're familiar with. Or if someone is used to using a computer, they would get a keyboard. Or if someone is used to using a stylus pen, they would get a stylus pen to use with their device. So it's almost getting these familiar add-ons so that something that seems completely alien suddenly becomes very familiar to the user. And then finally, there's the acceptance. And I think this is something that a lot of older people have. I don't know if it's resilience or wisdom, but there's this ability to be able to step back from a situation and go, okay, it's only technology. What does it matter? Whereas I think a lot of younger people get quite het up and quite anxious if they're unable to use a technology or a device. So what are the recommendations for practice? So why am I talking to you about these paradoxes? Why are they important? Essentially, when someone feels a paradox, it can cause a lot of sort of stress and anxiety. So when technology is being designed or installed, we should try and avoid these paradoxes. Consumers shouldn't be feeling these paradoxes whatsoever. So what can we do? So we need to ease the chaos and inefficiencies within technology. That means working closely with older people through things like co-production or focus groups, doing research into older people using technology. Also further understanding the older consumer. So what are the values? What makes a device efficient for them or inefficient? What makes something easy or difficult to control? Then ways to avoid over-dependence on a device. So I think what we don't want is someone to be so overly dependent on a device that they're not outside in the world, they're not out there enjoying themselves. So you've got to have a focus on social connectedness. That device needs to be able to connect that person with other people, but the device also should encourage independence, encourage someone to get outside, encourage someone to do the things that they're used to doing. And then also confidence, and this is something that older people are lacking massively when it comes to using technology. There's a lack of confidence. So technology should be designed so that someone feels confident and able to use it. A device should provide balance. So rather than replacing tasks, it should motivate and enhance normal activity and communication. Example I always give for this is if an older person suddenly gets an online shop, so they use their technological device to get their supermarket shopping delivered to their house. That's then stopping that older person from going out the house, maybe getting a walk, maybe meeting people along the way. However, if they were able to use their device to get the bulkier items delivered, the ones that they perhaps couldn't carry, they could then still go out to the shop for the lighter items. So it's about, instead of just completely taking a task away, creating this balance for the user. And then finally, enhancing the coping strategies, thinking about what are the coping strategies of people using technology and how can they be enhanced. So maybe devices should be designed already with that air of familiarity. Okay, I probably have gone on over my time, sorry about that. But that's all from me.
Thank you. Okay. I just need to position myself so I can see the screen for the next part. Okay, so at the outset, I promised a surprise extra speaker that isn't scheduled, and I also suggested that the speaker wasn't going to be me. Now, I partially lied there, it's a partial truth, but I have found a virtual friend who is going to help with the final presentation. So, as you can imagine, as some of you have probably already guessed, I asked ChatGPT. Now, I did constrain myself. This is only the second time I'd used ChatGPT, and I decided I would constrain myself by only giving myself really an hour to construct something to fill the little gap we had in the program. So I started by just asking it some very, very basic questions around terminology that were relevant to this session. Actually, that's not true. The first thing I asked it was, is William Webster a credible academic? And the answer, of course, was, the answer was unexpected, actually. The answer was, William Webster was a controversial former director of the CIA. Who would have known? So it didn't even know who I was. That's maybe not a good thing. Anyway, so I started off by asking it some basic terminology. I had some quite rational answers. So I revised my prompts. I wasn't 100% sure at the direction of travel of what the previous speakers. So I decided to ask it about privacy by design in relation to the lived experience, so a little bit more specific. So I started off by asking that specific question about why. I added why into the start of my first question. The answer I got back, which I will prompt up, what I'll put up in a moment, was very, very generic. So I asked it a more specific question. I removed the why and put, is privacy by design problematic for the lived experience? And then I asked it further questions about whether or not there was a divergence from the principles of privacy by design in relation to the lived experience. And then the questions became more sophisticated as I was playing with the tool. So I'm just going to put up some of the answers so that you can see the sorts of things and the sorts of ideas that this particular tool was giving me in this field that's relevant to this particular panel. So, first question, why is privacy by design problematic for the lived experience? So I had a very sort of rational, organised answer, which brought forward a set of reasons around why privacy by design could be seen as problematic. I've just listed those there. There was actually a paragraph for each one of those reasons, which I'm not going to go into, but trade-offs with functionality, lack of customization, innovation and development challenges, and cost implications. And then the final concluding statement was, while privacy by design is crucial for protecting individuals' privacy, it is essential to address these challenges in order to ensure that a positive lived experience happens for users. Striking a balance between privacy, functionality, customization, and innovation is key to mitigating the potential drawbacks associated with privacy by design. Okay, it's quite a neat sentence. It's quite general. It's easy to agree with, which is why I then decided I needed to refine my prompts and my questions. So I moved on to, is privacy by design problematic for the lived experience? So again, a very rationalized answer. Privacy by design is generally not problematic for the lived experience. Now, some researchers working in this area might disagree with that. It said, in fact, so ChatGPT actually is starting to get a little bit more pushy with me. It's telling me that there's a fact here that I need to take on board. It aims to enhance individuals' privacy and improve their overall experience by integrating privacy measures into the design and development of products, services, and systems. Privacy by design seeks to protect users' personal information and provide them with greater controls over their data. Here are a few reasons why privacy by design can be beneficial for the lived experience. So what I started to observe here is quite a formulaic response to the way that I'm prompting these questions. So the response here, for example, is quite a good example of that. So it starts by setting the scene slightly. It's erring on the positive side of the answer. It's trying to give a balance of different views. And this plays out more in the subsequent questions that I put to the software. Okay, so why is there a divergence from the principles of privacy by design in the lived experience of technology? So I'm starting to ask more pointed questions. Certainly, as I was using the app, I was feeling that I was trying to ask it more pointed questions to get something more valuable out of the responses. So here we have the quote: "The divergence from the principle of privacy by design in the lived experience of technology can occur due to several reasons." Again, it's answering with lots of potential avenues of thought. While privacy by design aims to prioritise privacy protection, there are factors which may lead to a gap in the principle and the actual experience individuals have with the technology. Here are some of the reasons for this divergence, and it's given 5 different reasons, of which I'm going to bring forward a few. I should also add, before it gave me this answer, it also apologised for the previous answer not being satisfactory to my needs, which was quite interesting. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of the points that it brought forward here. I'm just going to bring out a few. And I'm bringing forward the ones that I think are probably the most interesting, or the ones that I think probably require a little bit more thought. So, incomplete implementation or design flaws. So here, the idea is that privacy is recognising that privacy by design requires thorough implementation and attention to detail, but real-world scenarios mean that developers and designers may overlook certain privacy considerations or make choices that unintentionally compromise privacy. So as I was going through this exercise, I'd set myself, I felt now we're starting to get somewhere. We're starting to really get to the nub of what I was wanting to explore with the application at the start. Point number 4, it brought forward user behaviour and preferences. So this chimes with the presentation you've just seen. The actions and choices of individual users can contribute to the divergence from privacy by design principles. Users may not fully understand or prioritise privacy considerations, leading them to share personal information or consent to data collection without fully considering the consequences. This can result in a disconnect between the intended privacy protections and the choices that many individuals make. Again, starting to bring forward some really useful and relevant points. Point 5, emerging technologies and evolving practices. Privacy by design principles may not always keep pace with the rapidly evolving technologies and emerging practices that exist. New technologies such as AI or the Internet of Things may introduce novel privacy challenges that were not anticipated when the original design principles were established. Adopting privacy by design to these new contexts can be a complex and ongoing process. I think for my refinement of the prompts, we start to get to some more interesting points about privacy and design and the lived experience. So, given the previous prompt, the previous set of answers, I now decided to ask it, why is it so hard to build in human values into the lived experience of technology? Again, it apologised for not meeting my requirements for the previous question. And it says, addressing these challenges requires multidisciplinary collaborations involving technologies, ethicists, policymakers and various stakeholders. It necessitates an ongoing dialogue, transparency and participatory processes to ensure that human values are adequately reflected in the design, development and use of technology. Now, given that I'd given myself a little bit of a time limit, the obvious questions that I would have followed up on if I was going to spend more time doing this would have been, how would you achieve these things? Because this is obviously a very grand statement about how you can build in human values. So what started out as very simple answers became more complex and more general at the same time. Okay, so just to recap then, I did that presentation quite quickly using ChatGPT. I felt like one of my students preparing an assignment for me to mark. My experience, my lived experience of incompetence and competence in this particular scenario was that I had to really work at the prompts to actually generate something useful from the application. Many of the responses, there was a clear structure in the way that the application presented its responses. They were quite formulaic, quite structured. It was trying to balance off good and the bad all the time and then give quite generic answers, which, having used it just for that short period, it was quite evident to me. Now, you may have all tried ChatGPT yourselves and had similar or different experiences, I don't know. So, okay, so that's what I wanted to do to kind of fill that little gap in the session. I thought it was a little bit of fun, something novel, and I thought, given that the product is really less than a year old in terms of being publicly available, if we don't do it at this conference, it will get old hat in the future, so I thought I'd have a go at it. I've also added to this slide that I don't think ChatGPT is going to be fielding questions in the Q&A session, because I can't type that quickly. Okay, so we're at the end of this presentations. We have 10, 15 minutes for Q&A, so we'll follow the usual pattern, which is if you've got a question, please jump up and ask it at the microphone, and we'll redirect it to our panelists. So, the lived experience and new technology. Any questions?
Thank you for my comment stroke question to Anaj. That was a brilliant presentation, let me say. That was great. It's a concern that I've had and that I've seen some other people have. More a comment, but I would like your thoughts on this. The particular area of the damage to people when they have to review some horrendous material has already been addressed, not in the context of technology development, but in the social impact of information, in how police forces have had to deal with child abuse imagery in the past. Do you think there's much we can learn from how they did that and the rules and regulations? I know, for instance, that the UK police forces have very, very strict regulations about how much they can expect officers to review this material. They are required and provided with appropriate mental health support while they do it, and there is a time limit to how long they can be asked to do it. Do you think that's a good source of specific rules that we might be able to put in place for this? Because it's not the technological development, but it's dealing with the information that we've seen how we deal with that before.
Thank you so much for your kind words. I think that's a very interesting suggestion. It might be worth looking at the similarities and also the dissimilarities. In some sense, the data labelers and the online content moderators, they are performing a policing function. But they perhaps do not have that same sense of fiduciary responsibility, nor we look up to them as either guardians or people who are maintaining law and orders. In terms of the lived experience of these police officers, I think there is something to draw upon. my concern is that if we look into the established roles, if we look into the established power structures to come up with a satisfactory response in terms of how we have dealt with in the past, we may only have a piecemeal solution. While all of us have a stake in policing, when it comes to issues of systemic exploitations, we have often turned a blind eye towards similar cases of worker exploitations. When it comes to manufacturing of clothes, when it comes to tea industry, we have witnessed similar degree of systemic exploitation, but we have turned a blind eye. But now there is a system which, while being developed by exploitation, will be used for governance. In that sense, it's very similar to the police officer whose concerns you're highlighting. So in that sense, that shared lived experience, I think, is of great importance to draw upon. No, I will have to reflect more on this, but thank you so much for highlighting that. I will be thinking about this on my journey back.
Does anyone else want to comment on the question?
Well, not necessarily on. Maybe I'll wait for the next question.
Okay, so go ahead.
Thank you all for your presentations. I also really loved yours. I will talk to you after, hopefully. I have, I think, a question maybe for you or you. I'm not sure. So I think incorporating the values of users and workers is really important in technologies. And I also think it's important to be inclusive for technologies. At the same time, I wonder what the limit is in terms of inclusivity for a diverse range of needs of people. And I'm curious about your reflections on what one specific technology can do and what are maybe more wider demands of a market to kind of, making sure that different kinds of needs and values are representative, I guess, in a broader scope. Thank you.
Okay. Carolyn first.
I think it's a very hard question. How inclusive do we make technology? But I think the main issue with these sort of mainstream technologies is that they're designed by younger people for younger people. And it's very hard to be inclusive of all. I think to have a truly inclusive innovation, the marginalized group that are trying to be included within the technology need to be included from the beginning. So within the design process, within the whole process of that innovation, all the way through to market and through to usage. So that's how to be inclusive. Choosing who to be inclusive of, I guess that's a matter of segmentation. It's a matter not just of which segment is going to get me the most money, but which segment needs this technology, which segment would benefit, their welfare would benefit from that particular device or technology. So it's moving away from sort of profit and economy more to sort of a welfare and well-being model. Okay, does that help answer your question?
Thanks. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. For paucity of time, I will once again adopt the intrinsic and instrumental approach. There is intrinsic approach to diversity. There's intrinsic value to diversity in development and deployment of technology. I think we can morally rightly expect that our technology should reflect the diversity in our society. That's the intrinsic aspect. From an instrumental perspective, and I think this is a perspective which more people should understand. The surveillance system, which begins by targeting the socially marginalized group, does not end there. It gets extended to all social groups. We are all vulnerable at different times in our lives. Somebody who does not belong to a socially marginalized group may become vulnerable on account of mental health, may become vulnerable on account of becoming a migrant, on account of becoming a single parent. So at different points in time, you may become part of a marginalized group without even realizing, because there's an AI system who is judging you to be so. And in that respect, diversity also has an instrumental value. The way these disruptive AI systems are presently being developed, they represent social values of a very select group. And the biggest reason behind that is because they're being developed behind private corporations. We may call them for all the congressional hearings we want. We may ask them to cooperate with all the regulations we want. I think Lawrence Lessig wrote it best: code is law. And unless we can include diversity at that stage, I think this would be a job only half done.
Thank you. Do you want to jump in there?
I'm trying to find an angle to get in. Code is law, yes. I know that. I think when you talk about inclusiveness, it's what I tried to say about non-discrimination, basically how to ensure that technology doesn't discriminate. And that brings me maybe to a more interesting reflection, is that talking about data protection by design, etc., it's very difficult even when you write the law, or when you make when you design a system, to understand what is effective in the end and what is helpful for everyone. So where we discussed the fact that in AI systems we don't know anymore what's happening within a system, I think in many cases what we're doing becomes so complicated that we don't exactly know the effect on different groups of people. So when you talk about data protection by design, it's a recurring process. You must go back to the basis after some time and thinking, did this help us? Are we protected by this system? Are different groups of society protected by the system? So maybe that's something to big in, that it's not one-off when you talk about designing systems. Maybe that's reflection, but I was looking for something to get into your discussion, which I can leave to the others as well.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, thanks a lot for this very interesting panel. I would like to focus very much on the age question. There is a saying, the only alternative to getting old is to die young. And so this is a marginalized group we'll all end up in. I mean, we should not forget this. And there is still, and I would like to encourage you and other researchers in the field to become more radical in two ways. First of all, maybe this just shows I'm old, right? But everything you said were completely normal kind of dissonances that we all experience about technology. So in a sense, maybe an older person is the canary in the gold mine there, coal mine. So these are really requirements that we would need for all of technology. But on the other hand, I would like to encourage you to get more radical in highlighting the things that really marginalize old people. I mean, technology is just not built in certain things. It's motoric questions, it's cognitive questions, it's cultural questions, and it's infuriating how we basically throw away the dignity and the rights of a very much increasing part of the population. And that is not a question of, balance. That is just, you cannot put in a SIM card that has this size with old fingers. You cannot operate a chatbot in order to find a form that's simply not findable on the site. And so I think concentrating on these infuriating, really, really exclusive mechanisms of design would be a very strong statement. Thank you.
Okay, we are running out of time, so can we take the next question as well? And then it's going to be very quick replies, I'm afraid.
My name is Mark Leiser. I'm a professor of law, actually digital legal and platform regulation at the VU University in Amsterdam. I also live in Scotland and kind of go my time back and forth, so I'm familiar with the wonderful campus at Stirling. And I had so many different comments from so many different angles of this. What struck me as maybe a GDPR skeptic, admittedly, was that a lot of what you were saying is contradictory, and I don't know if you recognize that as a panel. On the one hand, you're saying data protection is to benefit mankind, but then it kind of has, well, we shouldn't use machines unless they benefit, it can be proven to benefit mankind. And on the other hand, we're saying, well, we have an opportunity to use machines to help vulnerable groups, but they're being designed the wrong way because we're not taking people into account. And I was looking at my own life in that very short sort of hour that we've been speaking, and all the different things that have happened over the past year. I have an Uncle Brian, I'll just call him an Uncle Brian, who is an older person, but he has a health problem. And the last thing you'd want him to do is to have a device that made him go outside. And at the same time, my daughter has a grandmother that has posted more photos on Facebook than Facebook probably has. So, and another grandfather who's never touched digital devices and doesn't have a Facebook account. So it seems to me that with design for certain people, that the focus isn't necessarily on design, it's about the ease of personalization. That we really can't have one person, one sort of law that fits into one umbrella, but we need the ease of personalization as opposed to, and design has to accommodate that. And then at the same time, I think we also have to recognize, and I know this is a privacy and data protection conference, but it's also computers, that sometimes, and I disagree with the comment that code is law, I actually fundamentally disagree with that. Law is law, and code is written by people who are subject to law. And I think that's an important thing that we don't muddle. The notion of the idea that content moderators are a result of the human in the loop. So the human in the loop is a legal creation. It's, at some point, when do we start holding data protection accountable for some of the consequences of the law itself? And I know we're out of time, but I hope we could reflect on that very quickly across the panel.
Yeah. Thank you for those two brilliant questions. We're not actually going to have time to field them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the three speakers just one really short sentence, because we have to wait for the next panel, one really short sentence about your ideas for just those two questions that we had there. And please pick up the questions later on in CPDP.
I totally agree with the sort of older people needing to be involved and working out where the pain points are in all different types of technology. And the issue is that they're not designed to be inclusive, these technologies, which is why there are so many issues. So I do completely agree that all those need to be picked up and looked at and considered within the design process.
Thank you. That was short.
Let me pick up with code is law. I really don't think that code is law. I said I know this knowledge, but law should be technological neutral. It should lay down general values. Should have a longer value than just the changing technology every year. So there's a big difference between code and law, but it's important that we have our basic values laid down in our laws and also the way we apply it. So I thank you for your comment, because I like that most.
Right, quickly then. The idea of a conception of normativity, or a normal person which is excluding social groups, is a very dangerous one, and I completely share the concerns that you've highlighted, and I hope we can talk and discuss this more afterwards. Thank you so much for your comment at the end, and love to discuss more with you. As regards the contradictions in our approaches, with a topic as rich as this, I think different perspectives should emerge. Whether they are complementary or contradictory, I think they are all welcome. The idea code is law is not as a substitute for law. It identifies different perspectives on regulation, markets, technology, social norms, and law. And in that respect, code is law is one part of the puzzle. But I look forward to continuing the discussion with you.
Okay, so that's the end of our panel. Thank you very much for coming along and for listening and joining in. Can we just finish by thanking our panelists for their contributions this afternoon?